Morning. Hope that you are all well. We are back at Thursday Morning Torah. And this morning, I'm going to explore in ways that I've written about and also in ways that I've not written about in this coming week's Jerusalem Post column, the concept of mitzvah. And I'm going to have a certain philosophical exploration of two approaches that, as I said, will complement, I hope, what I wrote about this week. Titzaveh, the Torah portion, begins, "You shall further instruct the Israelites." Titzaveh here being translated as instruct, or give them more mitzvot. And the mitzvah is the central concept of the Jewish tradition. And I want to talk about the first two ways to understand mitzvah and the philosophical background behind them, because I think most of us find ourselves in philosophy number two, but number one has a long and strong Jewish pedigree that we should be aware of. So the first meaning of mitzvah, as you may know, is commandment, right? Asher tzivanu, who has commanded us to do whatever. The second, more colloquial, is good deed. Like if you say to somebody, "Come on, pick me up at the airport," it's a mitzvah. That means like it's a nice thing to do. It's a good deed. It's not commanded by God that you pick me up at the airport, but it would be a mitzvah. So each of these meanings has behind them a deep and rich philosophical tradition that give color to the meaning itself. And let me tell you what I intend by that phrase. If we go back to the Akedah, to the binding of Isaac, why does Abraham do it? Why does Abraham follow what is clearly an immoral command by any human standard to kill your child? The usual explanation of the Jewish tradition, although there are many, 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 and we're not going to explore the Akedah right now, is human beings' obligation, certainly the Jewish obligation, is to do what God tells you to do. And you are not allowed to substitute your own moral sense for God's command. Because after all, God created the world. And therefore, when God says you should do this, not only are you not allowed to substitute your own moral sense, but you are in fact obligated to negate your moral sense. Let me read you a passage from the Talmud, from Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. From where do we know that a person should not say, "I have no desire to wear shatnez"? Shatnez is a combination of wool and linen. "I have no desire to eat the meat of pigs. I have no desire to engage in adultery, but rather I do desire. But what can I do? My Father in heaven has ordered me not to." It says, "I've set you apart from other people to be mine." As in, God says, the whole point of being Jewish is not that I command you to do things that you want to do. It's that despite the fact that you want to do certain things, the dispositive, the ultimate, the decisive factor here is God says no. And that's what's behind the idea of mitzvah, that your moral sense and your moral approach and your moral ideas and your sense of conscience are irrelevant ultimately to your Jewish commitment, because you have to do what God says you have to do. And that's one powerful approach to what mitzvah means that is deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition and has a lot of sources that would reinforce the notion, the Akedah being the most powerful of them, but not the only. So we understand that our job is to be servants to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. to be servants to God, and what God says we do. And the reason you don't eat a cheeseburger is because God said don't eat a cheeseburger. Okay? The second meaning of mitzvah, which suggests that you substitute in some ways your own moral sense, or at least your moral sense counts for something, also, interestingly, has not only warrant in the Torah, but very close to the same story as the Akedah immediately preceding it, and that is in the story of Sodom. God says, I'm going to kill these people. And Abraham says, well, what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? What if there are 40 righteous people in the city? What if there are 30 righteous people in the city? In other words, I'm holding you, God, to moral standards that I understand and accept and believe you should abide by as well. This is, by the way, part of the paradox of Abraham's story and Abraham's character, why he argues for Sodom and doesn't for the Akedah. But again, that is a subject for another time. Right now, we're exploring the second meaning, or at least the second implication of the meaning of mitzvah, which is in Talmudic studies and biblical studies, they call one apodictic and one casuistic. Apodictic is just, you have to do this. I'm telling you, do this. It's that simple. Casuistic is, you should do this because it will have these consequences or for this reason. And both of those meanings thread through the Jewish tradition. And they have a very, they have not only different sources in Torah, but they have intellectual advocates. Yeshayahu Leibovitz was a powerful modern advocate of the first understanding. He said, you don't keep kosher because it ties you to God, because it relates you to the community, because it allows Jews to have a certain separation, because it reminds you who you are every time you eat. All those reasons, he goes, they're all irrelevant. They may happen, they may not happen. You do it because God said so. And how dare you, which was really what Leibovitz said, how dare you substitute your puny human reasons for the divine will? And if you don't think that God said so, then the system means nothing. That was Leibovitz's view, right? Others, many others, Buber, Soloveitchik, Rosenzweig, Heschel, would often say that this is, that the system that God creates is such that the human conscience and intellect and striving is the idea that we should use it is built into the system. Otherwise, it wouldn't have given us a human conscience and intellect. And to struggle with God's commandments is a religious act, not an act of chutzpahdik rebellion, of like arrogant usurpation of God's dictates in the world. And so you can see that this conflict is a real conflict between the two different deep understandings of what mitzvah could mean. And they speak to different religious consciousnesses. And before I get to two more meanings of mitzvah, I want to emphasize that in our own day, the second meaning, that is, you get to struggle with your conscience, you have to understand, you think certain religious laws may not be as moral and so on, is almost ubiquitous, almost everywhere. But the first meaning has a lot of power and has a lot of importance in Jewish history. And we shouldn't lose sight of the generations of Jews who genuinely believed that submission to God's will and doing what you do because God said so was the sine qua non, was the sort of defining feature of what Judaism was about. And these were extremely pious Jews. And there still are some Jews today who do that, although even today, I think it is not as organic and as powerfully apparent as it was in earlier generations. Nonetheless, both of those meanings of mitzvah have deep warrant in the Jewish tradition, and we should be aware of both of them as we study Torah, because you'll see in the Torah that these two meanings in some deep sense still play out. When Moshe argues with God and Abraham argues with God, and we see things in the Torah that we think are not right, so we argue with God, and this is part of this long tradition. There is a third meaning to mitzvah, which is a sort of interpretive meaning that it comes from the Aramaic tzavta, which is to tie together. So it's a meaning that suggests closeness and intimacy, because when you observe a mitzvah, you come closer to another human being, you come closer to yourself, you come closer to God. And so you have all three meanings tied in one word, and then I'm going to get to a fourth in a moment. One being that a mitzvah is you do this because the commander of the universe, because rather the creator of the universe, has ordained this as something that you do. And the philosophical underpinning of that is that all of Judaism is essentially a system of God says and we do. In modern times, especially, that is less appealing than it was in ancient times. And even in ancient times, there was some protest against it. In modern times, the second meaning of mitzvah, which is a sort of collaborative understanding of God's command and human assent. That is, I do this mitzvah because it makes sense to me, but that mitzvah doesn't make as much sense to me. And that meaning, which leads to a much less easily coherent understanding of mitzvot, is nonetheless the one I think that most modern Jews adopt. The third meaning of mitzvah, which is a sort of subcategory of the second, is that a mitzvah creates a certain unity in this world. After all, most mitzvot are expressions of relationship. You could say that all of them are, depending on how widely you define it. But when you wrap tefillin in the morning, it's an expression of your relationship to God. Right? When you light Shabbos candles, an expression of relationship to God and perhaps to your family, or to those who are around lighting Shabbos candles with you. When you give tzedakah, it's clearly a relationship to the person who receives it and to the community. So the third meaning of being close, of being tied together, is one that makes sense of the system of mitzvot, not only as God's commands, but as boons to human flourishing. And then the last meaning that I want to bring up today, which again, this is part of what I wrote about this week in the Post, is the idea of the Sfat Emet, the Ger Rebbe, based on something that Rashi once said, but I didn't give the whole genealogy of the saying, it doesn't matter, in the Post. But he points out that in one verse in Proverbs, it says that the human soul is the candle of God. And in another verse, it talks about a mitzvah being the light. And so he ties together the idea that both the mitzvah and the soul are the light, and says that the human being, him or herself, can become a mitzvah. And retranslates the bracha, the blessing, as Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, who has sanctified us with your commandments, vitzivanu, and made us a mitzvah. And that changes the ethos of Tetzaveh in a different way. What God is saying in this somewhat fanciful but deep and beautiful interpretation is, I want you to become a mitzvah. My own take on this is that it's somewhat like the Czech psychiatrist who just died, whose name I have trouble pronouncing, it was the CZ, Mikhail something, Zelinsky, who wrote this book called Flow, that if you look at an artist, say a musician, when they start to play, at a certain point, the playing of the instrument stops being volitional. in a weird way. It's not like something that's out there that they do, that they're conscious of, that they're working at, but rather the music flows through them. They become the music in a certain sense. And this idea that the person is not separate from the music or from the act or from the talk or from whatever it is they're doing, that they are one continuous flow, is, I think, part of what the Sfat Emet means, that you become the mitzvah. And I will tell you, before I take questions, let me just tell you the story that I associate this with in my head. I didn't write about it in the post, didn't have space, but many years ago, and I hope I remember the story correctly because it was many years ago, it was decades ago. I was doing a panel for a bunch of rabbis with Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who was a rabbi in Sudbury, Massachusetts. I think now he's in Northern California. And he told the following story. It was in the middle of a winter night in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and it was freezing and snowing. And his wife was pregnant with their first child. And she turns to him in the middle of the night and she says, "I need a Snickers." And he said, "What?" She goes, "I need a Snickers bar." So he got up in the middle of the night, put on his coat and his boots, and he went out in search of a Snickers bar. And he said, all I thought about and all I cared about was getting the Snickers bar. That was the entirety of my consciousness. And I found it. I found a 7-Eleven that was open. I bought the Snickers bar. I brought it home. I felt so proud and so satisfied. And he said, and I realized, like, that's how you're supposed to do a mitzvah. It's all you're supposed to, it's like, this is the entirety of your universe, Rowan. And that seems to me a little bit what the Sfat Emet, probably the Sfat Emet wasn't thinking Snickers so much, but I think that's what the Sfat Emet was really saying, is the entirety of you is wrapped up in that doing, in that moment. And that's what it means to become a mitzvah. Okay, so Jim Friedberg, who is our source for all things Moby Dick, if you don't know this, says in the sermon chapter of Moby Dick, Father Mapple says, "But all things that God would have us do are hard for us to do. And if we obey God, we must disobey ourselves." Exactly so. This idea that mitzvot are counterintuitive, not counterintuitive, but counter your desire, is a deep religious idea. As you can see, I would say it's a Puritan idea. It's certainly a Hebrew Bible idea. I'm sure it's in every religious tradition, because after all, there would be no need for religious encouragement or legislation if everything that you wanted to do, you just did, and it would turn out to be a mitzvah. Okay, we have also a question from Claudia. Can the Akedah be seen as a warning against religious extremism, that God would never hurt anyone? Yes, it can. There are lots of ways you can see the Akedah, but I actually don't want to talk about the Akedah right now. I brought it in solely to illustrate this one idea, that part of the ideal of Judaism, one of the ideals, as you say, it's not the only ideal because we have a counter, but one of the ideals is that you do what God says, even when it doesn't make, like a lulav and an etrog. Really, do they make so much sense? Or the red heifer, which makes no sense. There are a lot of laws, they're called chukim, that specifically don't make sense. Forget even that they're counter to your moral sense. How about if they're just, it doesn't make any sense to walk around, with a palm frond, or to that the red heifer ceremony should have some kind of redemptive meaning. Why does it have to be a red heifer? Right, a brown heifer can't have that meaning. There are so many things that if the tzitzit are tied this way, it's good, but if they're tied that way, it's not good. In the Midrash, Korach, actually, in the rebellion, makes fun of Moses about these kinds of things. But the whole idea is that's what God said. I don't know if you know the end of the story about when Rabbi Akiva is being tortured, and Moses says, like, how could you allow this to happen? Because Rabbi Akiva is a great rabbi, this teacher, and so on. And God says, silent. That's what I have willed. And this is sort of the paradigmatic phrase, the slogan of this philosophy of mitzvah. This is what God wants. So your objections are irrelevant and arrogant and misguided and don't belong here, because God is the creator of the universe. So who are you to say that, yeah, God, I think you're wrong about this. So there is a sort of quadruple meaning here to the idea of mitzvah that I think gives us a beautiful arc of the possibilities of enactment in the Jewish tradition. And mitzvot can be simultaneously really all of these. Take the mitzvah of tefillah, of prayer. It is one, a commandment, whether rabbinic or biblical is a discussion, but it's clearly a commandment to pray to God, okay? Which means that you should do it because God said to do it. Second, it's something that human beings find great meaning and satisfaction in. And even people who aren't religious sometimes find themselves praying. So it is also built into us, and we can come along and say, yeah, God told me to do it, but I do it because it centers me, it does this for me, it does that for me, on and on. Three, prayer clearly ties us, especially tefillah b'tzibur, prayer in a community, ties us to one another. That's part of what prayer does for a Jewish community, is it brings us together. That's why you need a minyan. And lastly, there are moments in prayer, if you pray often enough, or if you're lucky enough, or whatever the alchemy of worship is, there are moments in prayer where you feel like you are totally swept up in the act of praying. And you no longer have that sort of critical distance that allows you to stand back from the act itself and evaluate it as though you weren't doing it, right? As though it's being done, but you can also watch it even as you do it. That you're sort of what a French writer called homo duplex, right? A double person, which is what most of us are most of the time, right? We are double people. We're both involved in an activity, and also there's a small part of us that stands back from what we're doing and is evaluating the doing of it and other surroundings and so on and so forth. And yet sometimes in prayer, you are fully present and there is no distance. And that's the other mitzvah. It's the mitzvah where you become a flow. And so I hope that is helpful. And I'm going to just take a quick look and see. Okay, Sandy says, how vital is it to understand the ethical imperative behind the mitzvot as opposed to we're just supposed to do it? I would say it depends what your religious disposition is. For some people, it's not important at all. Some people, like, I don't really care why. God told me to do it and I do it. For other people, it's of paramount importance because they won't do it if they don't understand why God told them. I think for moderns, it becomes much, much more, since we are self-assertive in a way that our ancestors were not. It becomes much more important to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And you can see all of modern Judaism, non-literalist Judaism, as an enterprise of explaining why the mitzvot are good for you, right? That's basically what rabbis spend all their time doing. You should do this because da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And you don't have to make that explanation if the answer to it is that you should do this because God told you. The only reason the explanation comes in is when the rationale of God's command steps out. But as long as you can say, well, yeah, you do it because God said it, then you're done. But if you have to say, well, Shabbat brings you peace, it ties your family together, it gives you a break from the insistent clamor of the world, all those things, those are all ways of saying you should do the mitzvot because the mitzvot are good for human beings. And in modern times, that's, I think, what our principal approach is. The only thing that we are certain, though, that we're certain is good for human beings is Thursday morning Torah. This has been demonstrated, I know, in many, many studies, as you know, and also God commands you to watch. So you have fulfilled both kinds of the mitzvah, and I hope it's been flowy, which would make it 3 kinds of the mitzvah. And because you have sent messages, that ties us together. It's all 4 kinds of mitzvah here on Shabbat morning Torah. Thursday morning Torah. For those of you who asked, yes, these classes are available both on my Facebook page and on the Sinai Temple YouTube site in perpetuity, basically until the end of time or until YouTube goes down. One of the two. I'm not sure which would come first. I hope that you will join us on Shabbat morning. I look forward to seeing you then. I'm glad that you joined us for the many meanings of mitzvah. Have a good